And so, yes, I'm the innovation editor at Sifted. Sifted is an FT-backed startup media publication. We write about startups. We are a startup ourselves. And within that, we have a strand of looking at corporate innovation as well. So that hence my interest. Deep tech is increasingly becoming a sort of topic for us. I think every VC now wants to claim that they're a deep tech VC. I'm a little skeptical about whether all of them actually have those credentials. But in our kind of early discussions with this panel, we were sort of talking a little bit about how deep tech is a really interesting opportunity for CVC investors, because there's one theory that says that, you know, this is sort of CVC's time to shine, because you have the industry credentials, you can de-risk things because you've got in-house experts, you can kind of invest much more wisely, potentially also, you know, on a longer term basis, etc. So this could be a really interesting moment for corporates and startups to really work together. But will it be so? And that's the big question today. So the purpose is not for me to talk, the purpose is for the amazing panel to give us their insights. So let me just introduce everyone briefly, and also I'll ask you to introduce yourselves in a moment. But we have Jacob Bryce, founder of Israel Venture Partners, who also works with lots of companies like Henkel and ABB to advise them on corporate venture. Then we have Ezra Carlson, who's the Principal Director of Business Innovation Consulting, who I know because he's done some interesting research into sort of the ways that sort of funding syndicates could work to kind of fund deep tech, particularly, you know, in better ways. So some insights there. And then we have Vaish Kavada, who from Salience Labs. And Vaish, I'm going to ask you to tell us soon about what Salience Labs actually does, because it is, I think, slightly in stealth mode still, and at least your website gives very few clues as to what the company really does. So it is fair to say that it's still kind of fairly early. So you'll get the inside scoop here, which I think is great. As we begin, and maybe I'll just go sort of to each of you in turn, but I think one thing, it might be worth just having a sentence or two on kind of defining deep tech as you introduce yourself, because it's a slippery concept. Everybody claims everything is deep tech. Lots of people have different definitions of it. So I'd just love to, if we just spend a moment clarifying that. But why don't you start us off, Jacob, because I know you've thought a lot about the definition of deep tech.
Hi, so everybody, hi. So I work as a venture partner for covering Israel for a few different CVCs, including ABB, Henkel, and a electricity company, Ches, Invent Capital. As for deep tech, so I tend to think about that. You have tech, 4 levels. You have tech-enabled businesses, of which, say, this market, UK, has a very large number. Then beneath that, you have selling software, or selling software as a service. Then deeper than that, you have, you know, self-learning software, selling AI version software that's AI-enabled. And then you have beneath that science-based innovation. What you consider deep tech depends where you come from. So if you're a UK VC that traditionally invests in tech-enabled business model, then everything from software downwards would be deep tech. Whereas if you're, I'm dealing in Israel, so deep tech for us probably would be more the scientific part. I mean, the part of AI that overlaps with the hardware would be perhaps the deep tech.
Yeah.
So it really varies on where depending on where you're sitting.
So a little bit of AI, but mostly things that are kind of genuinely.
From where I'm coming from, it's physics-based, chemistry-based innovation that I would think of as deep tech, or AI that is around those things, the pattern recognition. I think how you define it is not that important, but I just see that there is a scale, and people define it differently depending on where they're standing in the scale.
Yeah. And Ezra, do you largely agree with that? And also, do you think, I mean, is investing in deep tech different? You know, is it harder for companies to do?
So, I see deep tech as a category of emergent technology. So, for example, AI, biotechnology, quantum computing. I think the aspect of emergence is really important, and as Jack was saying, from scientific discovery or engineering innovation, and that typically deep tech, for me, is that it's highly disruptive. It has social economic objectives, so it can be used, and ideally it's used to come up with solutions to some of the biggest challenges that we face, and that it has long gestation periods, so you're in it for the long term. And I think more importantly, deep tech has not only the R&D risks, they've also got product market fit risks, which makes investing in deep tech slightly more challenging than other more mature ventures and opportunities.
Yeah. So definitely a different profile. And Vaish, you're actually living the deep tech life. So, I mean, again, tell us just a little bit what you can about Salience, and then where have you found it different in terms of the fundraising process, maybe?
Sure, thanks, Maya. So I'll give you a quick introduction to myself and Salience Labs. So we're a team developing a high-speed computer chip for artificial intelligence. So we use photonics, or light on chip, in order to target at least a 10x increase in processor speed. So we're definitely quite deep into the deep tech sector. I think generally a deep tech business is looking to quite violently disrupt a market, and it's based on a really core innovation. I can see from an investor perspective, the difference between us and other startups is generally we're trying to raise a little bit higher ticket levels, so larger amounts of money earlier on. And the timelines can look a bit different as well, because we're developing something new and it takes some time in order to be able to develop out that new technology.
Yeah. And you're not at the stage yet of working with or looking for corporate money, or would you look for it? I guess.
So currently we're closing out our second round of investment, and it's not looking that we would be putting some corporate money into that round.
Okay.
But we are interacting with corporates at the moment.
Okay, fair enough. So I think let's kind of start to pick apart this thesis a little bit that deep tech and corporate are, great together. Jacob, I want to start with you. I mean, do you think, we say that this should be a great opportunity, but the truth is that we're not seeing corporates backing really disruptive startups in anywhere near the levels that you might expect. So why is that?
It depends where the corporate is coming from. I think in the work I've done, I'm working for companies that are corporates that are very science and technology heavy. We do back them. I think that what's difficult is to set up the relationship where value is actually going to be delivered. It's certainly something that has happened. So, for example, in ABB, we invested in AI chip. Now, before that happened, it took us about a year. But before that happened, we worked a lot with one of our business units, BNR, and had the chip, even though the chip wasn't yet in tape-out, we had them working with the startup, testing it, and getting to a point where from the investment, from the time we made the investment, the business unit was actually working with the startup and working towards designing into a product. So that was a successful case. And Henkel, we've done the same. We've partnered with startups on the back of actual deep collaborations, where there's been a year or more of testing the product, of playing with it. Company that we invested in recently, sensor technology based on gold nanoparticles that produce that are 3D, that are printed, and produce a sensor that's so sensitive that it can actually detect when water flows through a pipe. It can detect the bend of the pipe from water passing through a steel pipe. It can tell you what's going on the inside. Now that is a cool technology, but we had to find for us the application, the business case, test it, get it with our field people, and we actually did that over about a year and a half, and then eventually made the investment. So I think in the corporate world, you can deliver extra value, but it's a long and engaged process to get there. It's not in the normal VC timeline cycles, but it can be mutually beneficial to do that.
Yeah. But do you find that you get any pushback still with things if it's too close to what the core is developing?
Oh yeah, definitely. It is actually hard to find the partner inside the corporate for a technology when it's very, very close to what is the core of what we do. So take ABB motors. We're one of the world leaders in large electric motors. If I want to bring them a motor technology, it's a huge hurdle to overcome. First they want to see it, but to convince them to do something with it, coming from the point of view of like this is what we do, or ABB ports and they're the world leader in ports and cranes for ports. So they were, bringing them autonomy technology for cranes, and they said, no, but we've been doing this for 20 years. For us to look at a startup is really, really like we're sure they can't be as good as us. So there's a huge barrier to get the corporate involved. The barrier is a bit less when it's something that's on the corporate's radar that's not the core of what they do. So, for example, adding a sensor piece to the machine that we've always been doing because we know the market needs that. So we know we're not the experts, so it's a little bit easier to get attention.
Yeah. So you need that kind of sweet spot between, it's adjacent to something that's important enough for them. It's got to be adjacent enough that they take it seriously and they actually do something with it, right? Ezra, you're nodding. I think if you come across this, that there's this sort of difficulty in trying to decide which kind of deep tech companies are going to invest in, what's too far and what's too close.
Yeah, I think the three top challenges is really who does the evaluation and how's it done. So in other words, if I guess you run into the tension if the R&D are evaluating the technology, that you run the risk of the not invented here syndrome, and they reject the new technology because it's competing. So I guess it looks. I suppose you're looking at your, should you have a joint corporate venturing and R&D manager. I think the other challenge is really the short-termism, the changing priority of the organization and the, to stay the course and to remain invested. I mean, because some of these investments that you're making and some of these deep tech investments are, relatively small for the corporates. That's, they're not huge amounts of money. So to make priority changes and to just in projects, and as there's a change of CEO, a change of management. So I suppose it's about bringing the linkages into the organisation, and I think maybe one of the third challenges as well. It's as you're saying, the business alignment. I mean, how close is it to the core business, and also being able the measurement, the KPIs, and how you're able to assess the value being created through this very early stage company.
Now, I think the other big question is when you do finally get the corporate and the deep tech startup working together. The other big problem that I've observed is just the failure to sort of really scale and do much with those relationships. And startups are always talking about getting caught in the sort of the death trap of the endless, proof of concept and so on. So Vaisha, I want to pick your brains here as someone who's at a deep tech startup, and I know you're interacting with corporates to a certain extent at this point. But what does kind of help from a corporate look like to you? I mean, what is genuinely helpful? Because how do you kind of, have you thought about how you make sure you won't get caught in that trap of doing these endless demos and things?
Sure. Yeah, and I think it's really interesting what's been said here as well around if you're approaching a corporate and you're targeting something that's at the core of their business. I think it makes complete sense that there's going to be a higher bar to clear because you're approaching a large company as a startup and saying, actually, we think we can do something better that you do at the core of your business, right? It's quite punchy.
Yeah, they typically don't like that.
Generally, that is a higher bar to clear. But I would say from a startup perspective, what I think is really interesting is that CVCs are in this really unique position to be able to due diligence deep tech companies because you have that sort of knowledge and capability within your organization to be able to understand the core of deep tech businesses, sometimes even earlier on than financial VCs might be able to. So I think that's quite a unique position. And to your question, Myra, for sure, I think ultimately, it's always going to be a little bit more complicated as a startup to accept corporate money, because it's not just a financial relationship then, there's also a strategic component to it. And so my view is that that should just be approached as with any other type of business relationship, right? Transparency and trust in that component matters. And transparency around long-term incentives and having that conversation and managing expectations early on can go a really long way.
You were also saying in the pre-discussion that that would be really good, like if you actually were able to find a corporate that did that and could offer you real strategic value, business value, that would be a preference for you over a regular VC.
I think so, right? Because, I mean, and there's always going to be a little bit of trepidation from a startup side, right? You think, when is it too early to accept corporate or strategic money versus, and what's the right time? And so that transparency and that reputation goes a long way into sort of easing a startup's concern about accepting corporate money too early. And that's important because, in a way, there is that time that you've got to clear as a deep tech startup, where you're working on building out an innovation, but you still want to be able to interact with customers and have those conversations, and that's a gap that a corporate could fill. That's where it could be a really interesting relationship to develop. So,
and is that, because there's always a question for me about, from a startup's point of view, whether it's more worthwhile to just have, you know, a business arrangement, you know, a customer relationship with a big corporate versus, you know, having an investment from them. You know, do you kind of weigh those up? I mean, both are obviously, you know, good in both ways, you know, different ways. But if you were thinking about sort of, you know, investment in the company, and maybe this is a question to all of you, but, you know, how do you sort of sell that idea that, you know, a big company doesn't just buy the services and therefore, you know, help the startup, but taking that equity stake and that's worthwhile.
So there's always a danger with corporates that management change, corporate restructure can change the whole direction of the company, can make the previous project uninteresting. The personnel change can cause a lack of interest in what you're doing. So I think it's from the point of view of creating successful value between the startup and corporate. If you have multiple touch points, the chance of being dropped is maybe less. So if you have a deep engagement with a commercial business unit and a plan about how that's going to actually even be important for the future of the corporate. And for example, in Henkel, a lot of what we're trying to do is to create future $100 million plus businesses that Henkel will be involved in or running through the venture activity. So if you create an alignment about what's important in business terms for the corporate, for the business unit, and maybe for the future growth of the corporate, and then you can actually cement that with the corporate venture money, and maybe if you can even have multiple different business units engaged, that makes you a little bit as protected as you can be from corporate restructure. And corporate restructure can always happen, and the entire business unit can be deprioritized, and that does occur. But having the investment piece together with the business activity creates a greater alignment going forward.
So who brokers that relationship though? I mean, would it be you that actually then goes and kind of goes to the business units to make sure that they're kind of adopting almost the startup? I mean, is it the CVC unit that does the legwork? Is it the startup?
Well, the different models in the CVC world, like I don't know if someone's here from Swisscom, which is on one side where there's great independence and they don't have that much tie back to the business units, but they do have ambassadors inside the business that they can talk to. Then you've got more what I'm dealing with in Henkel and ABB, where we only act by and through a business tie-up. So the function of the CVC team for a classic corporate VC is to work with the business units. There are now quite a few that are acting independently. I think you guys are independent in LG, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, you have some, and there are quite who here is from CVC that has some independence from business units?
All right. Which company are you with?
Yeah. So the example I gave that you have you have the freedom. So in that case, business unit engagement is less part of your process, right? But then But then the point I was making is, do you end up having how do you assure the long-term tie-up of interest?
Yeah, exactly. We have a slightly unique structure in that we have financial investors, institutional investors invested with us, as well as our sort of strategic corporate parent. So yes, we can make independent and long-term decision-making, right, in terms of those venture investments. We do try to tie up those investments with the corporate whenever we can, based on mutual interest. So we make introductions, we do POCs still, but we normally do that post-investment rather than pre-final diligence.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's interesting. And actually, on that note, I mean, let's open it out to the floor. Does anyone have any particular questions you'd like to put to the panel? Yes, at the back.
I think for Jacob possibly, and I don't see, especially you've got to have a high delta to be able to get into CVC and actually get a business unit adopting. Are there any thoughts for different financial models that would encourage this, like a loan note that would convert into a contract with a commercial team rather than actually tech? Different models that are less VC but focused on CVC that give confidence to startups that there is actually that the corporate can actually absorb the technology and use it and issue orders in the future.
So, and what's your name and where are you from?
I'm Rob Williamson, for International Trade, UK Government's venture capital.
Oh, great. Look, I've heard of other instruments being used, hybrid finance. There can be also contractual commitment as a sort of pre-finance. But why does one want to avoid, if one's going to engage as a business and one also wants to tie up financially with the startup, then why avoid equity?
Because you can fund startups as much as you want, but I worked for a rail edge company for a long time, and the amount, the budget to the corporate was minimal. You've always looked at the startup, and you can fund it. It's corporate VCs are born with open innovations, with exploring new ideas, leveraging other people's knowledge and capital, and you can fund it as much as you want, but unless you've got the commercial team in the room, typically that new technology won't get absorbed and adopted. You get directors who simply say, we're touching it, it's not our business as usual. So it's how do you get them commitment for a start? But there is actually mechanisms internally, people are working internally to create this pipeline that opens up for new technology to enter into service with a new product within a large company.
There's a lot of discussion about how do you motivate internally in the business units to make them, can you make a certain percentage of or KPI for everybody in the corporate to the extent to which they actually worked with or looked at new technologies or integrated new technologies. I think a lot of us in the CVC, classical CVC world dream that our business, our CEOs would make such a change to KPIs for the corporate. So it would be great if there were more mechanisms that created the incentive, but without, of course, the CVC doesn't have the power to implement that. So what you can do as a CVC is basically develop the human relationships inside your organization with all the business units. In Henkel, we're having fix monthly calls with each of the different business units and trying to have them be part of the process and have them actually own this interaction and continue to drive the progress on all the startups that they're looking at and be the facilitator for that. So there's a human dimension. I know even in independent ones, like the Swisscom case before, you have an ambassadors, you have a venture associates program, which we explored doing at ABB, where you put somebody in each business unit who's supposed to be responsible to relate to the CVC innovation unit. So there's an ongoing challenge of how do you motivate enough cooperation from the business units. I don't think there's any clear gold standard. It's an ongoing discussion in places like GCV, about what people are doing. If anybody has any views about what can be done, what's the best practice to motivate your business units to engage with innovation, please put up. Please put up your hand and suggest.
When Ezra, you jump in. Have you got a suggestion for how to do it?
I'm going to put up my hand because I'll just play back some findings from the research. Is that in order to prolong or improve the probability of success or the longevity of survival of the venture units, it requires internal and external relationships. And what that means is really between your senior execs and your business execs, but also the role of bringing in syndicates where you include with your CVC venture capital alongside, or other, CVC or VC investors in the actual in the using syndicated rounds. And I think if you look to other industries where this is really done well, look at life sciences. I mean, we talk about deep tech. Deep tech is not new. It's as I said in the beginning, the underlying thing about deep tech is about scientific discovery or new engineering innovation. And look at how companies that may not be there, the Nova Foundation, their core business is Novo Nordisk, which is diabetes, but the Nova Foundation itself, they make early stage investments, and they've got Nova Seeds, Nova Ventures, and they've got slightly different mandates, and their whole criteria is to bring biotech success to the Nordics. But if you look at what they do, it's all syndicated investing.
Yeah, it's interesting how you say about sort of the syndicates, because that solves one of the problems, which is the worry about taking money from just one corporate, which sort of seems to, not that it necessarily means that corporate has control over you, but it can be perceived like that. And I think, Vaish, you were saying that is something that every startup has to think about, and it's probably, the advice often is, take money from several or take money from none, at the same time. So.
Yeah, I think generally the simpler you can make it, the better. And there is some simplicity towards a slightly different approach to the financial component of the investment and then the business or the strategic relationship. And keeping those somewhat separate in a way can have a lot of benefits. And it's just simpler from a startup point of view.
Right. So actually that's a kind of counter view. So you might not be looking to have that deep integration, or at least not straight away, or...
I don't think it means you're not deeply integrated or you're not interacting with the corporate. I think it just makes the relationship really clear with what hat you have on when you're engaging with the startup. And it also helps to sort of manage expectations, because then you can approach the strategic part of the relationship as you would any other type of business relationship, and it keeps things a bit more clearer and simple.
Yeah. Now, I'm conscious that we're pretty much at the end of the session, but I just wanted to, give the opportunity to, for anyone else, if you've got a burning question to put to the panel. Yes, please. And tell us who you are. And
Rohit Talwar from Fast Speech. The nature of deep tech is that you're looking at things that might take a while to come to market. What sort of time frame do you look at in terms of how far out technologies might be commercialized?
Maybe that's one for you, Jacob.
Yeah, depends. This is something we also talked about internally in our panel. Take Samsung. They've created two different CVCs. There's Samsung Catalyst and Samsung Ventures. Ventures is dealing with things that are relatively near, and the business units will be using those things in the next couple of years, and they are doing it with the business units. And then they've got the Chief Strategy Officer of Samsung, who has defined the white spaces where Samsung can legitimately play, and they've created a venture fund around that. So Samsung Catalyst that can invest in these white spaces, which are much more in the future. I think it's difficult for a lot of CVCs to invest in those white spaces. It's difficult to get the legitimacy from your upper management, from your business units to do so, and not that many CVCs have the freedom to invest there. I know so the recent Hitachi Ventures is a relatively new CVC, and they managed to create themselves the capacity to do both. And this of CVCs that have that, I think that the CVC should be performing both of those roles.
How does Hitachi do it? Do they just have two separate pots of money?
No, it's the same team. They created a team that has independence, but at the same time is connected to their business units and trying to deliver products that are relevant to their business units, but also has the ability to deal with the future. If anyone from Hitachi Ventures team is here? No?
Yeah. No, anyway, it's kind of hard sell to to go tell your CEO that not only do you need a CVC unit, you need two.
Or one that can do both. But yeah.
I spoke to Hitachi Ventures a week ago, and I think what they made very clear, what was really important to them, was the strategic fit, and that they do invest in this new fund. Is looking at longer term and is looking in various areas. I think in biosciences around oncology, and I think if you're looking, like, if you take oncology as an example, the time horizon is probably about 7 to 10 years. So it's just going back to the example with Nova. I think Nova only starting to get exits now from some of their seed funds that they started in about 2014. So 7 to 10 years can...
I don't think 7 to 10 years is actually that difficult. When I was speaking to Christian Lindener from Airbus, I mean, he said, it's actually because they tend to think for them a medium-term horizon is 10 to 15 years, right? So the idea that you could build a whole company in sort of 7 is almost miraculous. So that's almost not the problem. But the problem seems to be more just keeping the internal commitment to that, which is what we spoke about before. So. Any last thoughts, Vaish, from, again, I guess it's, if you were, going into these relationships, I don't know, I think maybe we've covered it, but like, how do you, does that worry you that you might not get sort of the long-term commitment and that, a CVC will lose interest in you after a while, or?
Yeah, look, I think for our early stage investment, we've been really lucky to partner with sort of more financial investors that have that patient capital mindset. I just reiterate one of my earlier points. I think, deep tech companies are really looking at, if you look at the challenges we're going to be facing as a society over this next generation, whether it's climate change or in our own sector, the AI compute requirements doubling every 3.5 months, quantum computing over the horizon. Really, it's deep tech companies, deep tech innovation that's looking to solve these problems. And I sort of reiterate the point earlier that I think CVCs really have this interesting opportunity to be able to diligence these companies and understand the technology earlier on. And so there's perhaps not that harm in trying to break into that relationship in the way that some other funds and financial VCs are able to do so quite well.
Yeah, they just have to be willing to think, I guess, outside the box enough to really just, be willing to disrupt themselves very thoroughly by backing those companies. Ezra,
may I add to that, because I think it's really, and I think this was also raised this morning by Sir Ronnie Cohen, the importance of the impact. And I think that, for me personally, deep tech, and I think the role of corporates actually offer and can play a very significant role in helping deep tech companies come to life, because I think when you look at a whole lot of very early stage companies that are coming out, out of universities, or they require further grant funding. Relying on the grant funding pot is quite small, it's quite challenging. I think if you look at the Innovate UK and I4I, you got I think about 6 to 8% of the applications are accepted, which I think is a very low innovation rate. Obviously some of them are not worth funding, but the fact that these could potentially be really impactful innovation, and they kind of fall through the cracks. And the corporates have significant resources, not just financial. They've got the ability. They've got the the know-how. They've got the markets. They've got factories, and I think you mentioned that you had access to the factory through sort of one of your perhaps one of your corporate connections. So I think just the point being is that, you know, from an impact perspective, the corporate CVCs is critical for deep tech.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there that isn't getting discovered by anyone, and the corporates could be in a good position to do it. But I think, I'm afraid we're probably going to have to finish here. We could talk about this all day, but there is coffee, and everybody is going to need a little pick-me-up to get through the rest of the fantastic day. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to the great panel.